questions now. We do have a microphone, and so if you have questions, please raise your hand, and the microphone will come around to you. And again, if you could state your name and who you represent, and also who you're asking the question of. So.
Sure. Good morning. Damien Coulon from Le Quotidien du Médecin in France. My question would be for Dr. Jordan Schaeffer. I would like to know, the patient you included in your study who has this, who has both aspirin and NACO, do you know why they took aspirin in the first place? I mean, was it prescribed drugs or was it self-medication? And did they take aspirin specifically for cardiovascular disease?
Yeah, so that's one of the interesting things about aspirin, and something that can make it hard to study is that it's an over-the-counter medication, and that sometimes it can be patients will take it on their own, or you know, it will be recommended by a doctor. It's not something we've looked into in this data set, but it's something we've looked into a little bit in our other studies and are continuing to explore. But what we've seen is that there's often an under recognition by clinicians that their patients are taking aspirin, which is available over the counter.
Patients don't think of aspirin as being a drug. And so they take it because they think it's something they should take, it makes them healthy. They don't realize it has consequences, and they don't realize that bleeding is a consequence. Who's next? Back to back, yep.
Marty Chapman from the Limbic in Australia. There was some results recently, a post hoc from the Aristotle study, which looked at NSAIDs and DOACs as well. It was a much larger study. Can you comment on the similarities in the results?
I think I'm not familiar with that particular study. I know there's some other data out there. That was a review of the trial data. Is that right? Okay. Yep. Yeah, so I'd say one of the key differences was that ours is all real-world data of, or at least patients that are followed in community settings and academic settings, representing both urban and rural environments. And we have fairly accurate data on the aspirin use, which is can be hard to capture at times. There's been some mixed results, though, in the literature as a whole on this topic, so we still need larger studies to fully sort out this, this issue.
Down in the front here.
Great, thank you. John Geaver with MedPage Today. Dr. Young, what can you tell us about the regulatory status of the oral suspension?
Yeah, sure. So the company has filed, so Bayer, the company that makes rivaroxaban, they have filed in the European Union. So they have, you know, Europe has something called a pediatric investigation plan that has to be filed with all drugs, essentially, that are being approved in adults. You have to have a pediatric plan called the PIP, the Pediatric Investigation Plan. So, and that had to be completed by a certain time frame, and it was. And so all of that documentation has been sent to the EMA, you know, hopefully, I don't know, maybe sometime next year, I'm not sure exactly how long that'll take, this will be available over there. I think in the US, it's a little bit more complicated. There are discussions, you know, with the FDA about getting this drug available, including the oral suspension, which is, you know, was only available for the trial, so it's not available otherwise. You know, yes, I mean, there is a plan that it will be licensed, essentially approved for children, and the oral suspension made available, but I think there's still some negotiations between how long that might take and between the company and the FDA in the US, so it may take a bit longer. No, I don't think there's more research needed, you know, at this point, based on the data we have from the venous thromboembolism. There are other studies going on in other indications in children. Heart disease is a common, congenital heart disease is common in children, and often those patients need anticoagulants as well. So there is a study looking at that. I think, you know, the FDA, you know, may want to see all of that data before they feel comfortable licensing this in children. I mean, hopefully, I mean, you know, if I get an opportunity, well, I know some people at the FDA. I mean, after this is all done and all the publications are done, which, you know, the phase 3 has been published already, this is under review. This, what I presented today, is under review at a journal. you know, I don't think it should take that long personally as an academic and as somebody who treats these patients. So if, you know, if I have anything to do with it, I'll try to move it along faster. But you know, sometimes the FDA works in mysterious ways.
Next question down in front.
Oh, thank you. Andrew Bowser with Internal Medicine News. I also have a question for Dr. Young. So I'm just curious if there's a proportion of patients who are already, pediatric patients in the United States who are already receiving rivaroxaban, like in an off-label manner, like in a center, and if so, what are the results of that? Or I guess more what I'm thinking is you showed the Lancet results, which looked like it was a fairly similar rate of recurrent VTE for both the conventional anticoagulants as well as the rivaroxaban, and I think that was the conclusion of the paper, was there was the hazard ratio, but it was also kind of more or less similarly low, I guess you could say. So I guess this is a long way of saying, what would change with licensure in the United States or Europe? Would you still foresee barriers to this being used in clinical practice? I'm going to go ahead and assume that rivaroxaban is probably more expensive, I don't know, but than enoxaparin or something like that. And so what do you anticipate would change as a result of that licensure?
Sure. So, well, first of all, I'll tell you that enoxaparin is surprisingly expensive. I have families who, you know, don't have good insurance coverage, and you know, they're paying $200 a month for enoxaparin. So it's not necessarily more expensive or less expensive to use rivaroxaban. To answer your question, you know, there definitely are patients, including in my center, who are getting off-label rivaroxaban. And I'll just tell you sort of a funny story is, I had a patient, he was a baseball pitcher, he had a repetitive motion injury. We know that that can happen. He had a blood clot in his veins in his shoulder. When I went to talk to the family about anticoagulation options, I mentioned this drug rivaroxaban was only approved in adults. And then the mom told her son, who was 16, to stand up. Anyway, he was like 6'2", about 220 pounds. Here I am, like 5'6" and maybe 160 pounds. And she's like, which one of you is the adult? And you know, so I started laughing. I said, yeah, okay, good point. And so, I mean, he obviously was a physically mature adult, and I agreed to prescribe rivaroxaban to him, and he was able to get it through his insurance. I would say that, you know, we are prescribing it to children down to 14, 15, 16, as long as they are physically mature adults, and we feel confident using the adult dose. And for the most part, the insurance companies are covering it. I haven't had, sometimes no, but for the most part, they are. There is an effort. There's a study, not that I'm working on, but actually some of my colleagues are working on in the US. It's through an organization called the American and Thrombosis Hemostasis Network, ATHN. And they have a study through ATHN that is going to look at real-world use of all direct oral anticoagulants in children in this off-label use. So it is being prescribed. There is some work being done to kind of collect that data and see, you know, how are these patients doing in the real world. I think the main thing that'll change is that nobody's using this for a 2-year-old. And those are the ones that suffer the most from having to get the injections. Imagine having to hold your 2-year-old down twice a day to inject them with a subcutaneous drug. I mean, it is really, you know, I had a lot of difficult time convincing families to keep going with that. And so for those patients, you know, you can't use the tablets we have. First of all, they can't swallow tablets. Second of all, they're too big. Obviously, you saw the doses were small. So I think the most important thing that needs to come out of licensure is the availability of a child-friendly formulation. And that can only happen once the drug is licensed, and then that suspension we use can be made available. Otherwise, it cannot be made available. So I think that's the big thing, is getting it to the younger children who can use a suspension that you can dose any way you like.
Just to reiterate the issue that at adult or near adult doses, enoxaparin is vastly more expensive than rivaroxaban. Vastly more. I think people sometimes think because Enox has been around for a long time, it's cheap, but it's actually quite expensive. Other questions? Yeah, down in front.
So is Dr. Young, is pill splitting an option for children? Is that something that is being done? And can they, you know, can the pills be ground up and you know, made an oral suspension at home?
So we definitely don't recommend that. So these tablets are not scored. Yeah, you can get a pill cutter and try to, but I don't think, I mean, there's no data on how that even might work, and rivaroxaban needs to be taken with food as well, so if you crush it, and I mean, who knows what the pharmacokinetics would be. So that's the practice that we definitely do not recommend. You know, you can't crush it and make a home suspension. I will say, I mentioned that the first, and you know, we had a, you know, the sponsor had a you know, company work on developing a suspension, and we had one. Actually, it was sort of oral granules that had to be suspended, and it actually didn't really work well. It wouldn't stay in suspension. We had levels that were too low, so we had to go back to the drawing board and try a different way to make a suspension. So it's not that simple. You can't just ground up the pills and, you know, throw them in some, you know, chocolate syrup and, you know, and give it that way. I mean, we do that with drugs in kids when there's really no alternative, but that's definitely not a recommended practice.
Okay. And one other question, if I might, for Dr. Schaefer. I don't write about cardiology very much, so this may be a dumb question, but you excluded the valve replacement and MI patients for this. I assume because aspirin is customarily used. Is that actually justified by evidence?
Yeah. So that's a good question. Yeah, there is data that for patients with heart valve replacement, generally we actually avoid the direct oral anticoagulants for the most part, and then recent myocardial infarction is the stronger support for aspirin use. So those groups we left out.
There's in the package insert in North America for the direct oral anticoagulants, there's a black box warning against use with mechanical heart valves. There was a randomized controlled trial done which showed they were inferior to warfarin, and so they should not be used for that indication. And just to build on the previous question with respect to grinding up tablets, I actually chaired the Data Safety Monitoring Board for the study that Dr. Young presented, and you know, the message should be under no circumstance should either doctors or kids or physicians or parents be grinding up rivaroxaban tablets and trying to give them to younger kids, because as Dr. Young just highlighted, the drugs behave very, very differently, particularly in young children, than they do in even older children or adults, and that would not be safe and certainly would be off-label and dangerous. Other questions? Seeing none, I guess we'll call this to a close. Again, if you wish to ask individual questions, the speakers will be available, and you can ask them any questions that you wish. Thank you very much.